Good morning, everyone. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to talk about progress on future-proofing of PPPs around the world. We have a distinguished panel that is going to talk about their perspectives on future-proofing, and we are very excited to hear what's happening. As the world is changing, and especially in the post-pandemic world, we've now realized how important it is that projects are future-proofed, against unexpected events as well as events that we can predict. So we are pretty excited about the opportunity to hear what's happening. People who are in attendance will have the opportunity to ask questions as well, because we want this to be an interactive session. So for any reason, if you have a question and you're allowed to, please use the Q&A function. I'll be monitoring any questions that come in, and I'll be sharing that with the different team members. So we are going to start. I'm going to just do it as it appears in my block. So Eric, if you could introduce yourselves, tell us a bit about your organization and your ideas or opinions that you might have on future-proofing of PPPs, and then we'll work through the rest of the panelists one by one. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I know you're all in different time zones. I'm not sure what time it is in Houston, but it may be an unpleasant time. I'm not so sure, but I'm with the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific. It's located in Bangkok, Thailand. It is one of the arms of the UNHQ based in New York. We cover 62 countries from the Pacific Island states, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia. And my work, as my title currently, is a network coordinator for sustainable and resilient infrastructure. And I had just moved to this position from being the focal point for climate change and disaster risk reduction under the ESBN, which is the ESCAP Sustainable Business Network. So most of my work is linking private sector with government. And for example, we've looked at issues such as water scarcity in the resort industry. We've looked at ICT and building resilience by using Li-Fi. And my current work, I have two projects. One is on carbon capture and utilization with the garment sector and the textile sector, as well as the cement industry. These are linked together because this is something our executive secretary likes. So these two very different sectors have been joined together. And my other work is on using rigs and the undersea cables to augment tsunami monitoring, which means that countries don't have the opportunity. They have buoy systems, but most of the time the buoy systems are down due to theft, due to vandalism, or they break their moorings, or they can't maintain these. So the private sector has jumped in here, and because of GNSS, high accuracy geospatial coordinating, a ship can pick up a signal which is very, very different from surface waves. It can pick up a signal that is as small as 4 centimeters, pick up that tsunami signal, and then send it to a satellite, which sends it to an early warning center. And so the more ships, the more cables, and the more oil rigs that are involved, we just build redundancy, so we don't create a false information, a false signal. And on future proofing, it's for ESCAP now, under the PPP network that I'm been starting to coordinate. We're moving away from the traditional idea of PPP as a procurement process, and more like how WAPPP has said that it's we want to use it as a mechanism for sustainable development, and particularly through the Paris Agreement. So when we pick up projects for this, we're looking at things for 10 years more, that it's ready for such issues such as climate change. So if you're building a port, we want to work with such companies such as Fugro, who can do mapping of coastlines and then provide better information to do engineering, provide engineering data so that a country can be more ready for tsunami or for storm inundation and so forth. And some of the countries that have already done this are Singapore. Singapore has already raised its port up from, raised it 2 meters in anticipation of climate change. So I'll leave it at that. There's a lot I'd like to hear from our other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. And just a few words you've said have given me a list of great questions that I'd like to ask you. So thank you for stimulating thought. Dominique, if you can introduce yourself and tell us a bit about the water sector or the water industry, however you refer to it, and what it is doing for future proofing. And so I'm handing the floor over to you, Dominique.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, David, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak. And yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm in charge of public affairs for water management at Veolia. So I will definitely reflect, and mostly from the operations side of water and wastewater, municipal water and wastewater operations. I think that in terms of the progress made over the last couple of decades, I think we have to take stock of a brand new legal context with 2 features. The first one is that the wash sector is heavily framed by the very tight public market awarding procedures. So things that were true or possible in the 90s, I mean, are often no more possible. And the second feature is that there have been a suite of anti-bribery acts taken in various countries, which also change the day-to-day life. For example, we are now legally responsible for the compliance of our local partners. And so that's another duty on our shoulders. So I think that really these 2 features together make PPP a very, how can I say that, resilient solution for the long term for all stakeholders, and definitely the municipalities. And one of the features is that for the reasons I just explained a minute ago, there is extensive built-in auditing by third parties, which again is a way to, how can I say that, build resilience for the PPP. And there are old contracts such as those we have in Morocco, in Latin America, or Europe, Asia, elsewhere. But the reason why these contracts are still in operation is precisely because there were very accountable elected officials in these countries, which in a way framed the PPP to resist these new legal settings over the years and the decades. I think, and that brings me to really highlight that what changes everything in the end is the ambition and the commitment of the elected people. Of course, I mean, when one talks about resilience within the municipal water sector, a lot of the resilience is the political resilience of the PPPs. And this is where, again, I mean, the elected officials have a role, I mean, a prominent role, obviously, to play. I'll just take a very teeny example in one of the towns in the south of France, where there has been extensive media attacks, including from national television on the PPP. And for that reason, the metropolis hired a consultant to conduct a good, well-informed debate with the local CSOs, which resulted in a contract, an inclusive contract from 2020 onwards. And again, in terms of the political resilience, you want to know that the SPV for that particular PPP has a board of 10 directors, out of which 4 directors belong to local CSOs, one of them being an anti-PPP CSO. And again, I mean, I wonder whether in-house services there is that much voice given to opponents of the municipality. Again, 4 out of 10. So to go ahead and in terms of future-proofing the PPPs, there is a great deal of, how can I say that, studies to be done to ensure the best resilience, especially towards climate change and other changing circumstances. Last but not least, the population patterns, which are extremely, how can I say that, impactful on the resilience of municipal water and wastewater services. I think that, again, to move ahead, the PPP community must first convince itself that the PPPs are, how can I say that, a very convenient solutions to many problems. There is an increase and very legitimate scrutiny of the PPPs when it comes to the municipal water sector, water being a common good, etc. So the scrutiny is there, and again, is quite legitimate. But for all the reasons I just explained, in the end, the PPPs are a more secure route than the in-house service delivery. The other thing, which is relatively new in a sense, is digitalization. There have been debates in the past regarding how transparent PPPs are, etc. Now, for pretty much any contract that we sign, we have an almost direct data entry system all the way to the municipality, which gets near real-time access to basically to know where the operators are, what they do, what they have done, on which piece of equipment they have intervened, etc. So that is fully transparent, that is fully traceable, and again plays to the advantage of PPP, because when they tendered out the operations, I mean, they wanted KPIs for the environmental impacts, for the social impacts, for the government impacts. So all that is built in the PPP, and again plays to the advantage of the PPP. So I could talk for a lot more about that, but I think these elements all together, even though, I mean, you cannot say, well, there were PPPs of the past and now are the brand new PPPs. As a matter of fact, they developed over the years. I just shared a few features of the most recent PPPs to show how prepared they are. I mean, again, to build on the very legitimate social local society expectation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Dominique. Patricia, while we have you, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm really sorry.
No problem. I even had more excitement this morning. A car hit a power pole outside my house, and I lost all power, and I had to rush to a friend's house to be able to make this. So I get a reward for resilience, I think, and future-proofing.
Future-proof technology here.
Yeah. Patricia, if you could tell us your opinions on who you are, first of all, and then your ideas on future-proofing, so that we can continue with this very, very interesting input that we're receiving.
Sure, and I'm afraid I didn't hear Dominique's comments, but I can respond to a few that Eric raised, and I'm looking forward to Q&A. I'm Patricia Sulzer, and I've spent quite a few years working with International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group. In the last probably 15 years, working in the area of early stage project development, which is the providing of early stage risk capital, as well as our resources to develop projects, very often in coordination with a private sponsor, but also in coordination with governments, all pretty much PPPs. And I happen to specialize in the infrastructure sector. While renewable energy is a big part of it, I've worked on projects in quite a few other infrastructure sectors. And I'm really delighted to be part of the WAPP community now. It's a terrific organization. I love sharing the practical experience that we all have and float ideas and so on. I am a lawyer, and I thought that I'm fully in agreement with Eric about the need to future-proof from a technological perspective. And I've worked on quite a few projects that really suffered quite a few difficult technical issues, engineering, equipment issues because of catastrophes, some climate change, some not. I've been involved in a project that in Cote d'Ivoire that suffered civil war. So there's other kinds of disruptions, I think, that are really relevant to the infrastructure space. And I specialize in the developing countries. So that my context is very much about not only physical disruptions, but political and country disruptions. There was a fuel embargo in a project I was working on in Nepal. And while I do think, of course, as a lawyer, I think the contractual provisions are really important, the force majeure provisions that sort of lay out what the parties should do, a roadmap for what should happen. standstill, suspension of responsibilities, if payments continue, if they don't, and things like that. And insurance is often available for some risks, including these days catastrophic climate change risks. I guess I want to focus on what happens to the project in the time of disruption, and in particular regarding financial parties. And so I think, from my perspective, in addition to the contractual protections, there's a slew of important protections that can be built in from the beginning and should be considered throughout. For example, I think alignment of the interests of the parties and having the right parties at the table is really important. And I do think that DFIs play a particular role in developing countries in this regard, because they, while they have a dual role of making financial returns, they also, of course, are devoted to sustainability and development impact. But there's a lot of other financial tools that can be put into play, I think, and should be thought about at the inception of projects, increasingly, like contingency funds, whether there's a cash sweep that's setting aside money for a contingent obligation. I think there's a wonderful confluence of interest of impact investors and philanthropic institutions now that we really can bring to bear for the crisis situation, where some investors may feel constrained by the need to be repaid, lenders, for example, and yet I think there's an appetite among a new asset class to support projects in crisis. The earthquake in Haiti or in Nepal, and things where parties really do kind of rush in and support the project during the interim, while even just an assessment on the ground is being made of what the crisis is. I think there's some other financial tools we can get into if there's time, but I think in addition, it's really important for all of the stakeholders to have an opportunity to continue talking from the very beginning of the project and the project design. I think the track record of the parties before a major disruption and their willingness and ability and actually complying with the terms of their obligations under contracts provides a kind of soft tool for ensuring that the parties are going to be flexible in the context of these long-term PPPs and concessions. And so I guess what the summary is, and we can get into some of the detail, is that in addition to contractual protections, it really, the people matter, and the community and the government and the stakeholders, and making sure that you're continually developing and maintaining those relationships over the entire life of the project, I feel is really key. Let me stop there. I have some other thoughts on specifics on financial tools, but we can get into that a little bit later.
Thank you very, very much. I particularly like the idea of flexibility in contracts and approaches, because, sometimes the lawyers can be the best friends of a project, and sometimes they can be the impediments of success, because there is no such thing really as a ironclad contract, because circumstances change and we have to be flexible at times, or, abort the project, which doesn't always seem to be the best option because of some legal term, when we could be flexible and think on our feet and do something different. Richard, I'm going to hand over to you, all the way from Texas, and I think he is the earliest caller in, so we appreciate you calling in at this time in the morning. But if you could go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and some of your thoughts.
Well, great. David, thank you so much for your hospitality and your leadership, both today as well as continuously around public-private partnerships. I want to leverage the title of our session and focus on two words: progress and future-proofing. And I'll describe a little bit of what I do and what we're working on along the way, if that's okay, David. Let's start with the words future-proofing. We now have access to the greatest amount of data and data science than we probably ever have, and it will continue only to increase with the deployment of sensors and meters and modeling and drones and satellites. So one of the great benefits of assuring our future proofing is a significant amount of data. Now, sad but true, we are drowning in data and thirsty for intelligence. So converting all of this data into something that goes beyond the typical curation, often driven by policy or budget compliance. The fact is that if we define future proofing as projecting out predictive analytics, we also have an abundance of tools now that provide us some insights. That's great, except all the trends and indicators about what the future looks like ain't that great. And it's not anything that's a surprise to anybody that's listening or on the stage. The fact is that we now know we are going from tropical storms to stage 3 hurricanes in less than 10 hours, which gives less time for people to prepare and evacuate. We're seeing a consistent level of fires in different places around the world, not only damaging, obviously, the livelihoods, but also damaging foreseeable economics in forest and wood product. So I can go on about what we now know is a challenge about our future. And the question is, are we making progress towards future proofing? Well, that guides me towards, David, and the rest of the panel, why we started the Resilience Innovation Hub and side-by-side Resilient H2O Partners is pretty simple. You could care less about sustainability, resilience, you could be the most hard-hearted person about climate change. The fact is when you've lost $1 trillion on the U.S. Gulf Coast and a similar amount of money on the East Coast of the United States, the central part of the United States, the Pacific Ocean side, West Coast, it starts adding up. And therefore, the economic value proposition of future proofing is tied to the realities that we can no longer afford to operate businesses, design infrastructure, expand communities the way we have for the past 100, 200 years. And therefore, if what we are trying to do is mitigate, let's be blunt, mitigate the future losses, tied to the reality that we do care about ourselves and mankind, that we now have an opportunity to use data, use financial instruments, especially from national and global reinsurance companies that are making a pivot towards what we define as resilience, which is pre-disaster and risk mitigation. And if what a public-private partnership, and let me just say that I would actually add a fourth P. We believe that these are really private philanthropic public partnerships. And it goes to something that Patricia said about DFIs or social impact. The role of philanthropy and social impact investing is at its highest and will continue to increase. So if what we now have are parties that are aligned about future proofing, including, as I said, the insurance and reinsurance and alternative investing community, the question ultimately is, what kind of progress do we need to make in the deployment of the capital, the technology and equipment, the data science, and frankly, work with the communities in which this infrastructure is going to be designed, built, operate, and maintained. So I think the question of future proofing, check mark, we are past a tipping point where I believe there are enough policymakers, investors, construction, engineering, architects, you name it, community and civic leaders that realize that we are at a pivotal moment. Now, I'll leave it on this note, David. Are we making progress? We are making progress in a lot of other places than in the United States. And part of the reality here is that we have lessons to learn from Patricia and Eric, especially, not taking away Dominique from Veolia's role, but from the UN and the World Bank and the IFC. We have a lot of great lessons to learn about how communities have had to adapt and adopt practices in not only the design of the P4, the partnership, but also in the design of that partnership leading to innovation. And our focus, and I'll end on this, is our focus is unleashing innovation for resilience. And the only way we believe that unleashing innovation is to step back and realize that there are a lot of non-traditional partners and participants in these relationships that have incredible ideas, and they're not, blue sky, but also are bringing new technologies, new equipment, and these new best practices that need to be incorporated into the partnership. So I wholeheartedly agree, as Dominique has said, when you look at water, how we handle water around the world is so different from community to community, country to country, that getting some standardization of how we would approach the partnerships is never easy. But to leverage what Eric and Patricia have already said, we need to be flexible in our adaptation and adoption of innovation. And I want to strongly encourage our listeners that we have an opportunity now to share this kind of progress around very specific success stories. There's enough folks who are anti-public-private partnerships. They have all the war stories lined up about failure. However, there is significant amount of progress and success stories that we need to make sure that all of us that are listening in, David, and are part of this, we're kind of in our own bubble. We wouldn't be on this forum if we didn't support the idea of these kinds of partnerships. We have got to do a better job of sitting with elected and appointed officials, the civic community, and citizens in helping them understand how future-proofing is progress for them and the next generation.
Thank you, Richard. I really like that, helping people understand. I am going to quickly ask each of the panelists a question based on what they said. And if you could keep it a very, succinct, straightforward answer so that we can start looking at some of the questions that are coming from the audience. Eric, you talked about, building big partnerships between the public and the private sector. And I was just wondering if you could share some thoughts on how you would incentivize these partnerships. People, always talk about we should, and we, hold hands and dance around the fire together and be happy and that. But when it comes to that, then there's hesitancy, etc. Could you share just some ideas you might have on how do you incentivize these parties getting together in a willing partnership? Your sound, you're muted. You muted yourself again. Now you're on.
Okay, and it's very sensitive. If you just touch it, anyways. Okay, sorry for that. For ESCAP, we function as a regional cooperation mechanism. So when you bring the public sector and the private sector together, it's usually it's already a strong incentive. Let's deal with, since we have people to address water here, we had the provincial governor of Phuket in Thailand, provincial governor and mayor of Boracay, Philippines, and Bali, all looking for ways to address water scarcity. And all these three islands all have the same issue of having large-scale resorts. And the resorts also have issues where they have to tank in water, as there's no piped water. So water scarcity is a very big issue in these areas, not just in cities like Delhi. But we started to look at what is the technology available. And there's actually some very old technology out there, which is using they look like little water heaters or water dispensers, but these little machines actually take water out of, or water vapor that's in our air, and the humidity can be as low as 15%, and you can still produce 30 liters of water a day. So the resorts like that are run by Marriott or run by other big names globally picked up on this, and this also reduces water stress on the community. So for the public side, the issue was the same as for the private sector side. They both wanted this same outcome, how they can address water scarcity. And through this technology, that's these machines, I think, are cheaper now than $1,000 US to purchase. I think that like buying a LCD TV, the prices go down, the technology goes down. And this allowed many resorts to provide clean water each day, including water to do enough water to do laundry, for example. And it's the same with the tsunami work I mentioned earlier. Indonesia in 2019 had 2 tsunamis, and their buoy system was down. And it's very frustrating for them. It also impacts ports and damages port facilities. So the private sector also is interested in monitoring this. And since they have the technology already on the ships to do this, these matches are easy. So I think the short answer is, now that we're facing, like Richard said, climate change issues, or if you don't believe in climate change, you could erratic weather. And these things need to be addressed. And as Richard also mentioned, around the U.S., all the impacts on the coastal areas. Another area that countries in our region, like Samoa, Vanuatu, they came to us, and Fugro, which is a big, it's a shipping company, but they do more like undersea research and so forth. We're now doing bathymetric mapping, which can data on coastal areas, and that data can be used for engineering, can be shared with engineering companies to build better seawalls, for example, to see where the worst inundation would be from a storm, develop better evacuation routes. So all these things, because of climate change, I think it's pushed the public sector and the private sector closer together. I haven't really had to like incentivize anything. It's just that we're facing this drastic situation.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So one thing I do think is, common interest or common survival interest seems to be an incentive which we would be foolish to ignore. Dominique, you talked about, what I found fascinating is that you almost have to now ensure sort of legal compliance and ensure, so it's a bigger role. But the one thing that's also with legal compliance that I've always tried to understand, is political interference. And also, if you want to call it, so in the sense of, you talked about, some of the examples in France. I was wondering, how can you introduce the sense of, for want of a better term, political resilience into PPPs and just, get the buy-in from those people? Because if they don't support it, then there's going to be a lot of opposition. Just some thoughts from you, Dominique.
Absolutely, but again, I mean that this is what I mean. This is the scrutiny from the people, which is absolutely legitimate, and but then the political resilience, as I called it, I mean, really can only come from the elected officials. I mean, it's for them to make the decisions about how they want the service to be carried. The thing is. And this is pretty much what happened exactly in the city of Nîmes. I mean, they are faced with relatively or too frequent floods and a number of disasters which hit every now and then. And when of course, I mean, as you could imagine, I mean, the opponents to the PPPs, I mean, just blamed on the operators at that time and say the PPP is no good as a route to deliver the service. The municipality and the metropolis, I mean, they said, well, I mean, let's rub this PPP angle to it. I mean, what is it that the community is faced with? These are the floods, this is the changing climate, the water scarcity, the need to reduce the leakage rates of the that's fine. Let's develop visibility and all what Richard was developing earlier in terms of data acquisition and this is this bunch of data that they've crunched. I mean, to actually elaborate what were the how can I say that the targets within reach of the metropolis in terms of the resilience against too much or too little water, and they said, all right, and to get there, let's craft a PPP which has these as KPIs. I mean, the number of days of outage and etc., and the increased resilience towards floods, and because of course it's also an issue at stake. I mean, the better inclusiveness. 1% of the money is directed at poor households, etc. So again, I mean, they sort of move the debate away from being simplistic as being private or public, which frankly, in terms of municipal water, doesn't make any sense, because in the end, 60 to 80% of the money in the end winds up in private pockets for either supplies of electricity or vehicles or pipes or whatever. So again, the public-private debate is meaningless per se. What makes sense is what are the targets? How do we get prepared to get there? And this is exactly what they've done. And this is the way I see a number of elected officials in quite many countries around the world say, I don't care whether the cat is gray or white or black. I just want the cat to catch the mouse. And this is it, especially in this time of climate change. This is where we want to go. And again, also, I mean, reflecting on Eric's thoughts, when you embark into a 10 or 20 years PPP, the offer is binding in terms of the technology that you put in the wedding basket, and in terms of their long-term effects and resilience to all sorts of unpredicted circumstances. So again, I mean, this is an asset on which the local communities can elaborate and derive the resilience. And what strikes me is that everyone alluded to at some point in time something will not meet the expected circumstances, and this is where flexibility is needed, and this is where frankly the history, I mean, from the past 20 years is all the PPPs that I know of have faced such circumstances where they just were short of, how can I say that, very short-term solutions. And so the sort of easy escape is to say, well, the PPP was rubbish. And the more long-term view was to say, all right, what is it we can do together better? And for all these PPPs that kept on going, I mean, everyone is very satisfied because it still developed the access to water, which is definitely an issue for the Global South, whilst they ensure the better resilience to floods and etc. I have, again, examples of that pretty much everywhere in the world, including Japan, including US, by the way, etc. So there is this, how can I say that? Ultimately, yes, it's in the hands of the elected people, I mean, to be bold about their choice. Sorry, I'm talkative.
Thank you very much. I appreciate those comments. Dominique, you touched on it, and there is a question also from Mr. Nair in this regard, and I'm going to direct it to you, Patricia, because you did touch on it as well, is the whole idea, of flexibility, how do we adapt, and then how can we tie this into technological obsolescence, which you made a big point about. Do you want to share some comments with us in this regard, please?
I'll try to. I really like Dominique's commentary on the and it goes to the question I think you're raising about political resilience. And I think one of the things that we've found over the years is, of course, it really matters who the private party is that's partnering with the public, and it really has to be one that can deliver and actually meet its obligations. The KPIs are really important, and kind of involving the public in the solution, making sure that not only the existing government, but like the government writ large, different factions are supportive of the PPP solution. And I agree that we shouldn't necessarily focus specifically on that it is a PPP as much as we have a project that's delivering this particular service or asset. But I think the ability to meet KPIs, to show the public that the project is delivering, that they're in a better situation than they were before, is really critical. And it's not just a tick the box exercise. It's one of those things that has to be sort of in existence throughout. The other thing I've been thinking about for the last couple of years is, and it goes to this flexibility that's built into the contracts, is because of these, even if something's anticipatable, foreseeable as a risk, and even if the force majeure clauses, contemplate something, really there's difficulties and disputes that arise throughout. And so while disputes are typically, and I'm not just saying as a legal matter, but these are commercial disputes where parties are not seeing eye to eye on who's going to be kept whole in different circumstances, what's going to happen to the plant, the part that's not working, and so on. I believe that there should be a really effective, what I like to call a partnering committee. You probably all are familiar with different kinds of organizations, project management tools that are key at the inception of the project and throughout, ensuring that not just the contractual parties, meaning the government, the private sector operator, but also other stakeholders, the workers, the employees, the community, are involved throughout to understand what's happening to the project. And maybe it's almost like a PR campaign, saying, as Dominique was saying, this catastrophic event has happened. Here's how we're going to manage it. Don't forget that this was delivering as promised for many years, and here's what's going to happen going forward. In terms of building flexibility into the structures, I really like the civil law concept of the equilibrium clause, which is, when I first started reading them when I was a younger lawyer, it seemed to me that it was kind of an agreement to agree. It was just a big kind of gray area where parties said, if things are not working out as planned, let's get together and try to solve the problem and put people in the position that they thought they were going to be in before. But the concept of that, I think, is really important, as well as buffers in the financial model, backup plans, backup financing. And so I think the flexibility it comes in many different ways. Let me just. Yeah, so I think that the flexibility has to come as well, not through just the contracts, but also through, as I mentioned earlier, I think making sure you have the right parties at the table. And if you don't, if you have some parties that are not going to be willing to discuss adjustments to the original plan, perhaps replacing them somehow. And I'm not sure exactly. This is where, again, I was thinking of impact investors and DFIs really, potentially having a role. Other organizations, I mean, USAID, UN, there's lots of different stakeholders these days who are really prepared to step up to the plate in a crisis beyond the humanitarian donations of organizations that have also really been key. On technical obsolescence, it's a tricky one. Even if the technology is not changing, competition is really hard to deal with. And so these long-term contracts really are commitments on everybody's side to stick with the program. And so it occurs to me that one of the things that might be kind of contemplated is ensuring that if there's an opportunity for an alteration to the original technical solution, there needs to be financing that's accompanying that. There needs to be attention paid to the original equipment suppliers, the original operator. On it's not a charitable, project. They need to be able to make the returns that they originally thought they were going to make. But I do think there's some other solutions, other equipment supply and financing opportunities that are out there. And it is difficult. I acknowledge, I think I saw one of the questions in the Q&A saying, how do you plan for this in advance of the project or an inception for something that might happen 20 years later? It's tricky. But again, the alignment of the parties, I think, is really key. And keeping in mind what each of those parties' financial and development objectives are is really key. And then, of course, just praying that everybody comes out together on the proposed solution.
Thank you very much. One thing I have seen in some countries, and I think procurement agencies have to work on that, is that in PPP procurements, they call for innovation, and innovation costs. And then when they do the scoring of the contracts and the evaluation, a company that's very innovative might actually score very high on the technology or the technical score. But then when it comes to the financial score or the evaluation, then they don't do as well because they are very costly. And in that case, you will find that contracting officers are so focused on getting the best, the best price or bid or however you want to call it, that they fall short there. And this is an area where we really need to train procurement officers and the procurement team to think out of the box as well. Richard, you made a statement that kind of is true, and even though it's controversial, is that here in North America, specifically the United States, we're just not doing well. And yet we seem to be hit by major events. You were hit by the terrible ice winter storm in Texas that, disrupted everything from water supply to you name it. And, and then you listen, in state legislatures and all of that had opportunities to fix these things through legislation, et cetera, and to introduce better practices and to introduce the concepts of sustainability and resilience and adaptation, et cetera. Why is there hesitancy? What do you think the reasons are behind that? If you've got some ideas, we'd like to hear those.
You want me to answer it real? It's stupidity.
Okay.
I'm going to be honest about it. All right. And I'm doing it because as a fourth generation Texan, having lived in Washington, D.C. and seen all kinds of different, interesting things. We got warned 10 years ago during a major ice storm. We got warned 10 years before that during a hail and ice storm then. Let's be honest about it. Elected officials have a phenomenal best practice called kicking the can down the road. If we're not going to be honest on this panel, I'm just going to be the only guy that gets, hammered after this is all over, so I can imagine the text messages. But I mean, one of the issues is that we're dealing, and I want to go back, play off of what you asked me, but leverage again the title of the session about future proofing. We have a lot of knowns. We have more information than we ever have, as I mentioned earlier, about what the knowns are going to look like. the same time, we have a lot of unknowns. All right. So the idea of any kind of partnership is the assumption of roles and responsibilities and risk, and who gets assigned that risk, who manages that risk, and the cost of the transferring of that risk between the parties. Now, Patricia, I am not a lawyer. I have a government English degree, which qualifies me to be the mayor of nothing. But the reality is that what we are doing in looking at future proofing is we know the risks are abundant, and we know where now the risks are most likely to occur. The vulnerability indexes around the United States and around the world are increasingly improved and enhanced. One of the challenges is that, like public shareholders who demand stock values on a quarterly, annual basis, elected officials get elected every year, 2 years, 3 years. When you're talking about a 25-year instrument, that's well beyond their profile of courage. And therefore, one of the challenges, and the reason why I keep on coming back to progress, lack of, or opportunities for making progress, is something that I will, David, go back to as my simple Joe kind of explanation. I've done several public-private partnerships, or at least facilitated. And I keep on asking the elected and appointed officials the same question. You want to move sand from there to there? Yes. How much sand? When do you want to move it? What is the sand going to be used for? How much is the sand? How long do you need the sand to be used for? After that, stop telling me how long the handle should be, what the color of the 4 wheels should be, and what is the depth and degree of the wagon that I'm going to move it. Just give me the performance of how I need to successfully deliver water at a price and a value to assure an uninterruptible supply of water or sand or whatever it is. So I think the challenge that we often find in the states is that the cycle of elective politics does not allow for long-term commitments and partnerships. And then on top of that, David, now I'm going to really sound like I'm bashing my own country, but it's relevant because I think it's also lessons learned, David, from different parts of the world. There's all kinds of challenges in each community, each country. But one of the things that I've also noticed is that there is a distrust of the private sector on both ends of the political spectrum. Distrust of the private sector means most of the time somehow, and there are bad apples all the time. There is no question about bad apples, and that's the reason why somebody like Patricia, who knows that if you design the instrument completely and thoroughly up front with a lot of different review in it, you're going to kick out a lot of the bad apples, but that's going to occur. But let's really talk about future proofing, and that is that we need probably the most flexible instruments than we ever have, David, not only because things are changing at a rapid pace, whether it's the technology or the situation on the ground, all right, including the political situation on the ground. So we need flexibility. That is not typically built into the DNA of elected officials. So that is the reason why I think we tried to do it in Texas, where there would be a kind of third-party entity partnership with the comptroller of accounts to help review partnerships in a way to one, structure them very effectively up front, but also design them with some flexibility. That office never was really used, never really funded. So I would encourage, David, and I'll stop on this point, I want to play off of what Prath has asked in his question, because it's very, very specific to what we're seeing, and that is that the insurance, reinsurance, social impact, and non-traditional investors are pretty much saying We now need to look at the design and engineering of this infrastructure and figure out what we can put into it that will not become obsolete in a short amount of time. And I'll use an example, and that is we now have nanofibers that can be incorporated into concrete and the rebar to detect damages or potential failures well before the failures ever occur. They're not that expensive. It's getting the engineering firms to adopt these kinds of innovations into the partnerships.
Thank you. That's wonderful. We have a few minutes left on the session. So what I do want to give each of the panelists is an opportunity for a closing comment. Please, if you could limit it to 1 minute, and then we will be about out of time. So Eric, if you would like to just give us a closing comment. And you are still on mute. There we are.
Okay, spending so much time playing with the mute button. It was excellent to hear from everyone. I don't think I could say anything in such short terms, but I'm very thankful that this session was put together. I'm very thankful that David was very competent at letting us all speak on this. So I will leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dominique. You unmute? There we are.
Yes. Okay. Excellent. My closing comments is I endorse basically everything that's been said thus far. Something in PPPs. I mean, there is always a public party to the contract, and we have to acknowledge that in the end they are the duty bearers. And for that precise reason, at my company, I mean, we always respect their decision, whatever it is, and even if we don't share the view. Because there's extensive, yes, this whole debate about the terms, etc. But again, they are the duty bearers, and therefore we're bound to respect what they decide, even if we have to. How can I say that? There is a great deal of uncertainty, and we expect a lot from these elected officials. And the most comfortable situation for them, and to a certain extent, we've got to acknowledge that if there is no clear picture as to where they can go, the easiest solution is to stay in-house. As simple as that. If you want to go into a PPP, you have to elaborate, just like Patricia did put it, gather the stakeholders, elaborate a master plan as to where they want to go and what resilience they want to have in the system. Otherwise, it's not going to fly. And if for whatever reason, political reasons, it's not manageable to gather these various parties, they stay in the situation they are in and just do, the very obvious fixing things to go to the next stage, but they cannot embark in a bold PPP. And again, if we are to embark in a bold PPP, there is this extensive planning ahead with, quite an amount of consultancy involved, but not only technical consultancy, but also into social science. Thank you very much.
Dominique. 1 minute, Patricia.
Right. First, I just wanted to thank you, David, and WAPPP for putting this session together. I think the entire meeting is really interesting. The whole session, all the sessions. And yeah, I guess I would just echo, I really appreciated hearing all the different perspectives, including on the amazing amount of data that we have, as Richard was saying, to foresee technical obsolescence, catastrophes, ice storms in Texas, and glacial lake outbursts in Nepal, and I think a lot of these things really are predictable. But in the end, and I like to emphasize this because I think lawyers do get a bad name in all of this. But I think if one could pose the question of resilience in the framework of, is it more costly from a developmental and financial perspective to restructure a project that didn't anticipate issues, or to design it correctly up front to provide flexibility, to make sure that there's a huge amount of attention paid to the building and maintenance of relationships among all the different the stakeholders. It's really not incidental. It's something that should be taken as a completely separate work stream that is given resources to really function properly, so that when there is a catastrophe or disruption, that the parties will come together rather than fall apart. I think that's really critical to PPPs. Thanks.
Thank you, Patricia. Very short, Richard.
Well, let me apologize for being the sand on the oyster and trying to find the pearl. So every once in a while, I do rub a few people wrong. So apologies if I have, but it is in good spirit and good heart. Let me emphasize, David, something that we did not touch upon, but I do want to end it on this. 70–80% of the assets, land and assets in the United States and typically around the world, are in the hands of the private sector. That is the reason why we have been seeing increasingly number of private philanthropic partnerships that then invite the public sector to the table, because the private sector philanthropic assets reside adjacent to the public assets. I do think that we often only go to the table thinking that this is at first a public sector driven focus of these partnerships. And I increasingly will say we've seen this occur in a number of places, that we need to talk about how to collaborate with these private philanthropic partnerships as a model as well. But thank you for your time, David, and thank you for allowing me to be amongst this group.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate all your inputs. It was a very engaging conference discussion, and I can say I learned new things, and I hope that everyone else did, because learning is one of the best things. This isn't the end of the conversation. Should you wish to continue as a conference participant, you can find each of us on the attendees list. It's an opportunity for you to share ideas, reach out to people through whatever way you can. But let's keep the conversation moving forward, because it needs to move forward. And I don't think there's anyone here on the panel who wouldn't love to have a conversation with somebody. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, and see you next year. Thank you.